Good evening. It is certainly, I heard Ray on that one. Good evening. Mike, you're the only one who can get everybody to speak up. It is good to see everyone here. Certainly glad that you're with us, and again want to wish all the mothers a happy Mother's Day and hope you've had a great day and one that you certainly deserve, as good as it can be. Also want to appreciate, those who are watching know we appreciate them watching as well. We are going to continue our series tonight on looking at these questions that Jesus asked, and just as kind of a precursor, I guess. Very soon, what I'm going to do is open up these questions that we're looking at Jesus asking, and eventually we're going to get into questions that the apostles asked as well, looking at Paul's, questions that Paul asked in his epistles, asking those who James in his writings and Peter in his writings, looking at the questions that they did as well, because there's so many great lessons to be had with the questions that they posed to different people. But for now, in the next little bit here, we're going to be continuing these questions that Jesus asked. With it being Mother's Day, I wanted to kind of keep the theme as focused on mothers. I mean, sometimes we just hear a lesson on Mother's Day, and then we don't hear another one for a whole year, and certainly they deserve more attention than that. In fact, that we ought to spend as much time as we can just lifting up parents and mothers in particular with all the great things that they have done for us. And so we're going to keep that theme tonight. There's a question that Jesus asked of his mother. In fact, it's one of the only, if not the only, question that Jesus ever asked of his mother. And it concerns the very first miracle that was performed. If you can turn to John chapter 2, this is where we find this question. This is where Jesus asks his mother this question. And, the very first part of John's writing. John did a lot of writing very intimately about Christ. He knew Christ on just such a close personal level and appreciated him so much and wrote a lot about things that the other apostles did not cover, and this is one of them. And John, and as we see in John chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as the Lamb of God, and from there he starts to gather more, his disciples, and he starts to talk to them. He knew how to talk to people. Jesus was a people person. He loved people, and he loved being around people. And this was one of the instances where he did, in fact, it was probably the first major group setting that he was in where a lot of people had gathered. And we see this invitation that he gets to this marriage feast. The question that he will ask his mother, and we'll eventually get there, but I want to show the question, then again look at the context of this so we can understand it in further detail. But he asks her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me?" Now, when we look at that term, woman, with him calling her that, in a modern day society, and today, you probably don't want to call any woman by that name and identify her as woman. It's not the most respectful thing in our modern day, but as we're going to see, it wasn't always like that. It was actually a sign of respect when he called her that. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But in John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, we see how he gets invited to this marriage feast. And it says, on the third day, John writes, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And so we have this wedding, and these were big occasions a lot of the time. Jesus, enjoying the people like he did, was invited along with his mother and his disciples. Jesus, and he loved the marriage. And what a great time this was to celebrate something like that. Jesus sanctioned the marriage institution. We looked at this last week and the importance of it. And so to Jesus, this was a very great occasion for the two that would become one flesh, the two that would become one and united in this relationship. And so Jesus is there with his mother, he's there with his disciple, and keep in mind also that in Palestine, the marriage ceremony typically began at twilight, and there were some of them that could last up to a week. And so these were very big deals with the wedding and the reception afterwards. On this particular one, for whatever reason, it seems like it was only one night, And so there wasn't a set time that they had to do, but many of them would take up to that week to celebrate it. You also notice something that here that which really caught my attention, and that is that John identifies Jesus' mother, or he just describes her as the mother of Jesus, which is really kind of peculiar, because you would see a lot of the other writings from the apostles, and even Peter and so forth, they will list her as Mary, and they identify her. John just calls her the mother of Jesus. In fact, he never called her Mary by name. Very seldom would he ever call her Mary by name. And this could have been that he just assumed people knew who it was when he would speak of her as the mother of Jesus. And what great respect that was for John to do something like this. That he could have just said Mary was with him or she accompanied him, but it was the mother of Jesus. And so he had great love. In fact, John, was the one at the end that was, ended up taking care of Mary. And so he had this great relationship with her. He had a great relationship with the Messiah while they were on the earth. And so here he was writing about this marriage feast that they would attend. And also, as it mentions, with his disciples. Now, this is one of the earliest descriptions that we have of Jesus having disciples. This is before, in fact, his disciples that he would have had at this time, and of course, a disciple is a follower, so they must have followed something. They must have heard something that Jesus said in order to be his disciples. Or it could have been the case that that it described him as his disciples, which, or in other words, that these were the ones that would become his disciples, and they were just describing them. It was before, though, the apostles, and before he would actually set certain disciples apart as apostles. But when you look at the setting and where it was, some of the disciples that could have been during his ministry at that time could be Andrew and Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, John, and James, when you look at the timing of everything. And so it's interesting that he would be there with his mother and with the men that he knew that he would become close to and celebrating this marriage. But then something happens. It's something that is, we look back on this, and it is one of the most major things that we read about during Jesus' ministry. Jesus did so many things that we know about that have been recorded, so many miracles that he had performed. And you think of all the great miracles that he has, that he was capable of doing and that he did do, and raising the dead. He did that on a couple of occasions. He healed the sick on a couple of occasions. He would sit with these lepers and heal their illness. And so there were so many different things that he would do. In fact, we have in the New Testament where not even everything that he had done could be recorded. In other words, he was so active in the lives of these people and so active with his supernatural abilities in helping them that they couldn't even keep up with it, but they did record what God wanted them to record. He gave us what God wanted us to know, and this is enough, isn't it? We don't need to know all of Jesus' his miracles. We don't need to know all the miraculous things that he did. We are able to know enough to know that he was the most powerful man that had ever been on this earth. He was also the most loving. He was perfect. But to think what he was capable of doing is just astounding. And to think to be in the midst of one of these miracles must have been an amazing thing. But this is the only miracle of this kind. Never had he ever done something like this, at least not that we have record of. But there was never a need for it either. But it's also interesting with this miracle that not everyone was going to see it. It wouldn't be visible to everyone. And that plays an important part with why Jesus asked this question that he did to Mary. Because Mary encroaches upon the purpose of Christ. I don't think she meant to do this, but I see Mary, knowing what mothers go through and how they think and understanding how they want the best for their children, and they always want their children to be in the best possible light. And we saw that this morning with the wife of Zebedee, who wanted James and John to be in the best possible light when she asked Jesus if they could sit on his right and his left. And they don't, that's how mothers think. That's what they do. And I think that's what Mary was looking at when she was looking at her son right here. But in verse 3, it says, when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, well, they have no wine. And I can just see this setting of, in this house where so many people were gathered together and friends and loved ones, and it was a great occasion, and it was joyous, and they'd already been there for a while. And we'll look at that in just a moment. And so, this is a setting that John starts to write about right in the middle of everything. And they run out of this, wine. Now, what we need to consider right here is that, a shortage of food or drink when guests were invited to a house, not having it, was considered humiliation. They never wanted to come up short. And it's kind of the same for us today, isn't it? When we invite people over, or when we have, that's the one question that, that always gets raised, or the one concern, I guess, that gets raised when we have a potluck and we have visitors and we have a lot of people, we always worry about, is there going to be enough food, isn't it? And sometimes we have to go run out to the store and bring back food. We want to make sure that everyone gets fed. No one ever complains about too much food, because we know how to fill those styrofoam plates and send them out and send them with everyone, right? And most of us probably don't mind taking them home with us. But we always worry about not having enough. And so imagine inviting a bunch of people over and running out of something. And so this was such the occasion. And so I can see all the people, going back and forth, and they'd been eating together and, enjoying each other's company and so forth. And, this wine, and, I want to pause right there, because this wine does not mean alcoholic wine. Don't think they're just drinking themselves into oblivion right here. That's not what this was about anyway. But they run out of this wine, this grape drink that they would serve. It was a very social fruit of the vine. And I can just see Mary turning to her son, knowing what he was capable of. She knew who he was. She knew he was the Son of God. She knew that he was powerful. But no one had ever seen anything up to that point. And I can just see Mary turning to him and just saying, we ran out of wine. And listen to what Jesus tells her. In verse 5, first off in verse 5, I'll go back to verse 4 in just a minute. But in verse 5, for Mary to do this really implies a couple of interesting extra facts right here. In verse 5 it says, his mother was said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. This tells us a couple of different things. Number one, Mary was definitely interested in being at that feast. And out of anybody who could have said anything about this shortage of wine that comes up, it was Mary. And so likely, by this implication, her interest in the feast and how she addressed the servants when she told the servants, hey, whatever he does, do what he tells you to do, suggests that she knew the family. She was comfortable with it, wasn't she? She was comfortable enough to call this out. She was comfortable enough to bring it up and worry about other people that might have been there. And so whoever the master of this feast was, likely she knew them on a more than just kind of an acquaintance level. And she was comfortable enough to tell them, to do whatever Jesus wants you to do. And then she states that, the immediate issue. We ran out of something. And even though she, lists the immediate issue, when you look at Christ's response, his answer gives us the impression that it was not just, that when Jesus answered her, the way he answered her shows that, it was more than just simply being out of wine, what Mary was asking him to do. Mary, think about this. She knows he's all powerful, and this is like saying, can you not show them who you are? Can you not show them how great and how powerful you are by doing this? And the reason why I say that is because Jesus was about to do that anyway. Jesus was going to change that water to wine. She had no idea what was going to, she had no idea that was how he was going to do it, but she was worried about the shortage. And she knew that he was capable of providing more on a miraculous level. And so the way that he answers her, coupled with him just end up doing it anyway, tells us that this was not just simply about doing a simple miracle and showing everyone who he was. And let me explain further what he means. He reproves her when she says this. Go back to verse 4. You look at this and it says, Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not come." Now, why would he say that and then right after that give everyone, fill all these water pots and turn them into wine so everyone can have it? It makes no sense if he just says, okay, no, my time hasn't come yet, and then, right after that he says, okay, now my time has come, and now because there was something more at play with what Mary wanted him to do and to show. But he tells her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me?" That's where this term, woman, it's meant to be respectful in that way. You'll see several different places in the New Testament where someone would address someone else as woman. It was a term of courtesy and understanding who they were. And it was actually a way to kind of lift them up back in that day and to show great respect to them. But Mary overstepped. I don't think she realized she overstepped, because I think she had the best of intentions with this. But she overstepped in that she petitioned Christ to show his messiahship with this miracle. And Christ, being who he was, mildly rebukes her. Why? You think of who Mary was. This was the mother who raised him. This is the mother, that he had great respect for. He loved her more than anyone. But she was in a role that was subordinate to his divinity. Even though she was mom, and even though she provided, I'm sure at a young age, he was still the Son of God. And though she was a parent, she still was amenable to who he would be. She played her role was subordinate to his role and his position as God incarnate. And what he's telling her is not disrespectful, but he's saying, it's not time for me yet. She's wanting something more. And he's saying, wait. How many times do we see that in Scripture? Where God doesn't do things on our time all the time, does he? God has his own way of doing things on his timeline, and we need to understand that and we need to respect that it's going to be his way. I heard someone say something once that when you ask God for a favor, he answers one of three ways: either yes, or no, or wait. Because it doesn't always happen right away, does it? And that's what happened with Mary, wanting Jesus to show himself. J.W. McGarvey had this to say about it, and I thought it was very interesting. McGarvey wrote, "Our Lord's answer indicates that Mary's request had in it more than a desire for the gift of wine. What she principally wanted was to have Jesus manifest himself as the Messiah. Jesus gave many secondary, but only one supreme manifestation of his glory or messiahship. His miracles were secondary manifestations, but his passion was the supreme manifestation, such as we see in John 8:28. Jesus called the supreme sign his hour. His mother sought for a supreme sign, but at that time only a secondary sign could be fittingly given." I don't think I found a better description of this, because we know that Jesus was going to go on to do amazing things. And then he performs his first recorded miracle. And we see this in verse 6. How now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. Okay, so the very people that Mary says, okay, you do what he tells you to do. Jesus said, okay, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, okay, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. And when the master of the feast tasted the water that was made wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, they saw him. The master of the feast called the bridegroom, and look what he tells them. He said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now. How interesting the timing of this. Because Jesus brought something that was good and made it better, didn't he? And that's the other way that we can know that Mary meant something more than just there was no wine, because when Jesus would do a miracle, it was for a reason. He would always do it. And you think of so many miracles that Jesus did, and it was never done, okay, in such a secretive way that someone might not know it was from him. That master of the feast thought it was the bridegroom who had switched this out. He had no idea a miracle had even been performed. In fact, the only ones who saw this and knew what happened were those servants and Mary. And yet they didn't say anything because Christ said, no, it's not time. But then look. In verse 11, it says that this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And so there was a process that was being done right here. This was the very first one, but then more and more, as we know, would follow all of these different things. What is also important to get from this setting is that this is not a moment used in a way to prove that social drinking is okay. And if you try to use this setting as in trying to prove that kind of error, you've missed the point of this entire account. This was Jesus at an amazing social gathering with his friends, with his mother, and teaching his mother a lesson, asking her. But he had such great respect for her that he didn't make a huge scene. He simply just told her, or asked her, what do you have to do with me? My time hasn't come yet. She knew eventually that it would. She would see it. And all the people in Cana would see what he was capable of doing. But not at that point. I imagine when, with doing something like that, obviously it was going to draw some attention if anyone else would have seen it. But it was still not his time to reveal himself. We know that he wasn't about to do that. He was going to start gathering disciples. And he was going to start building his case for the ministry that he had set out for this earth. And those miracles would be a big part of it. But they weren't the main part of it. We didn't see that until the very end of his life here when he defeated death. But when you look at this and look at verse 11 and see how this was the beginning of everything, the miracle was a manifestation of his glory. Mary knew at that point the miracles that Jesus would be able to perform. And I have a feeling she understood when he told her, my time has not come. She would see it in Cana. She would see it elsewhere, wherever he went, to see all of these miracles. Don't lose the point that is being made with this miracle and why he asked that question to his mother. That is exactly what Christ does. He changes the worse into better. Think about that. He changed something like water. Not that water was not important. We know water has great uses for it. But he changed it at that particular time. It was this social thing that and he changed the whole, the nature, the consistency of what this would have been. He always changed it for the situation. He always changed it from worse to better. That's what Christ is capable of doing. That's what he showed on this occasion. And he can change a sinner into a disciple. That's what Jesus does. That is the power of the Christ and the gospel that he gave to us, is that it is always going to change someone from a lesser state to a greater spiritual state. That's what we can be. If you've been baptized, then you know and you get it, that you have been in that lesser state. And you know how amazing it was when you came up out of that water to be in that greater state. Understanding that I was so low or felt so horrible, knowing what my destiny was going to be. Some people don't understand that until they're shown. But when we were baptized, we knew we were made better. And he's also able to make better those who have fallen away, those who need forgiveness. We need his forgiveness. There's no other way we're going to get to heaven than to seek that forgiveness. But aren't we glad that he's always willing to make us better than who we are? That's what Christ wants for us. And if you're here tonight and you do need to be made better, please come forward. Let us pray with you. But don't leave here without changing that state. Let's stand and sing.